Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth, and opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. Don't use the word mythology for any of the native cultures, and especially of the ancient Vedic texts like Purana, Mahabharata, and Ramayana, because those are filled with authenticity. I have proved myself in my little capacity, whatever I could see, that Ramayana Mahabharata is actual history, and Ramayana does touch Americas because North America was fully covered in snow during that time. But it does touch America, comes very close. Peru, right till Mexico, and other places, it comes. Ramayana comes there. Sugriev's armies search North American continent also because it's all connected land. North America, South America, connected land. Panama was an artificial uh, passage made for furthering the trade, but it is only one connected land. If you look at the entire geography of the world, it's one connected land. The Asia meets America in Alaska, and then all the way south. And from the southernmost tip of South America to Antarctica is just 670 miles. And from the other side of Antarctica to New Zealand or Australia is another 1200 miles to 1400 miles. Not far if you look at the global. So it's all connected land. All lands are connected. Anyway, I have a very special guest today, and we are talking about my favorite Sankaracharya, Pandit Kota Venkatachalam. The more I read about him, he becomes my favorite again. I'm a fan follower now. So his grandson is going to present us on the Uttar Paksha. Let us welcome Shri Sastry Yanamandra.
Namaste, Adiji. Thank you for inviting me back to your show. And my namaste to all the viewers of Sattology. And it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much. So one thing comes like Pandit Kota Venkatachalam has authored so many books on every different topic. From Lanka position, we already discussed that. He already said it. And the position of Brahmanda, like the different stars, different planets, the distances, he has mentioned that. He has also mentioned about the other historicity of the chronology. Many chronologies, he has mentioned that. So tell us about his books and his works before we begin the presentation.
Certainly. Pandit Kota Venkatachalam was born in 1885. So he was actually a contemporary of Max Miller. Now, early on, he had grown up well grounded in the Puranas and Itihasas. So around the age of 23, around the age of 23, which is 1908, is when he started understanding and realizing that there are distortions in Indian history. And then when he started researching, he found that the root cause was that William Jones had actually made some distortions, principally because William Jones actually liked Sanskrit so much that with the help of some pandits in Bengal, where he was a Supreme Court judge, he actually started understanding kavyas like Shakuntalam by Kalidasa. And as he went into that, for some reason, he wanted to understand the Indian chronology, and he wanted to find parallels to Western chronology. And in his mind, the most similar event that he could find and connect is the Great Deluge, Noah's Ark. So the Great Deluge. So he thought initially that the Great Deluge corresponded to the Matsya Avatar. So, but then he was looking, being a staunch Christian, he was actually looking at Sanskrit texts with a Christian lens, and he could not accept dates older than 4004 BC. 4004 BC is where the Bible says that the world was created in 6 days and God took rest on the seventh. So William Jones had to shrink Indian history to fit the biblical timeline, and that is where the distortion started. So when Pandit Kota Venkatachalam discovered this, he found all dates were off by about 1200 years because of the distortions introduced by William Jones, and because of the confirmation and corroboration by other mercenaries of the East India Company like Max Miller and Fleet and Buller. So because he was well grounded in the Puranas, he could recognize this right away. And then he spent the next 51 years of his life from 1908 to 1957 reconstructing Indic chronology from traditional sources.
So, so one of the interesting thing is like the Indic sources, reconstruction chronology. Did he use a lot of astronomy as well?
He used as there was a yes he did. There was a good deal of triangulation in his research work. So he felt that texts are the primary evidence. So he believed in the texts, and for corroboration, he used astronomy. He used what we call prashastis, inscriptions, epigraphs. He used coins, and he used a number of other sources to corroborate what he found in the text. But in his mind, texts were the primary evidence.
Let's begin with the presentation and then see the Uttar Paksha today of the chronology, which is very important for us. And we already did some parts of Purva Paksha also in Lanka and other places. We did that. So viewers can watch a channel, Pandit Kota Venkachalam playlist on Sattology to see all the videos of Sastriji in one place also. So do that when you get a chance. Yes, please go ahead, Sastriji.
Yes, so I'll share my screen. So can you see my
yes.
screen?
Yes.
Just let me maximize it.
Yeah. You can see that. Can you maximize it?
Yes, I'll maximize it.
Yes, you can see that.
You're able to see it now, yes. So very good. So in the first two episodes, we had covered the biography of the author in the first episode. And in that episode, we talked about his methodology and approach, which I touched on briefly today, that he believed that texts were the primary evidence for reconstructing chronology, and all other aspects, dimensions, and corroborations were simply corroborations. The second episode, we talked about the Purva Paksha. He said, what is the problem? So he had to understand the problem first before trying to look for a solution. So we talked about what he discovered and how he sized up the entire problem in the first place. And the third, which we will start today, is his response. What was his Uttara Paksha, which is the reconstructed chronology. And in that, he has divided this into 4 parts, and I will get into that in a second. But I wanted to briefly recap episodes 1 and 2. So you see that he was born in 1885 and lived on till 1959, when, as a Shankaracharya, he attained Siddhi. He spent his 40 years doing his research. The reason he spent 40 years doing research is because we had to reconcile data and evidence from multiple sources. And so that reconciliation took time, and this was before the time of the internet, before the time of Google and PDFs, and before copy-paste was available. And so these reference books were usually available only in large libraries and state libraries. So you had to go from city to city to be able to access these texts. And these texts could not be checked out. So you had to sit there and actually write your own notes. And that is why it took about 40 years. And then once he was satisfied that he had done all the research he could, then he started publishing his books in 1949. But I would like to point out that a lot of what he published in his books, the research began much earlier in 1908. So he was actually a pioneer. And one of the titles I want to point out, he has received several titles over his lifetime, but the one that I want to draw the viewer's attention to is Bharata Charitra Bhaskara. So Bharata, of course, means India. Charitra means history. Bhaskara means the rising sun. And that is the picture I've actually used on the cover. So let me go back to the first page and show you this picture. This is an artist's rendition of his title, Bharata Charitra Bhaskara. So you see the rising, you see the sun over there, and all the rays emanating from the sun. Each ray has a date that he was able to reestablish and reconfirm as the true date of a particular event or of a particular historical figure. So that now his methodology, it's multidisciplinary. He used the texts, he used astronomy that Kadiji had asked, he used archaeology and inscriptions, but his reliance was on ancient texts as the primary evidence. And specifically, Puranas and Itihasas are a source of history. Now, there is a misconception today that there is no documented history in Indian texts, and that is simply not true. That is simply not true. So he is trying to reassert that Puranas and Itihasas are a fabulous source of history. They're very rich in data. He was an active participant in conferences, and here I list a few of his papers that he had presented in the 1950s. So the first one is where he tries to expose William Jones's distortion of how William Jones connected Alexander to Chandragupta Maurya, although they were 1200 years apart. And that is the beginning, that is the source of all the distortions. So these are some of the papers that he had presented. He was also an active contributor to research societies. And in those research societies, he would present his own discoveries for peer review. So all his work has been peer reviewed by peer scholars of that time. And there he would defend assertions when challenged, and then he would refute those disagreements with evidence that he was able to find. So now his approach was to reconstruct the chronology. You have to identify a date on which all other dates depend, which is called the sheet anchor. And so in this case, Panditji felt that the Mahabharata war was the sheet anchor, and all other dates depended on establishing the correct date for the Mahabharata war. And based on that, following the genealogies of long-lived kingdoms, there were some 5 long-lived kingdoms like Hastinapur, Magadha, Ayodhya, Kashmir, and Nepal. By following the genealogies of these, you're able to corroborate and triangulate dates of events as well as historical personalities. And then you find that the Puranas and other chronologies are consistent. They're all the Puranas and all of the chronologies like Nepal, Kashmir, Buddhist, and even Jain chronicles are consistent from the Mahabharata war. And then corroborate with literature, inscriptions, coins, prashastis, and even foreign sources, because the Western calendar and the Indian calendar are so different that it is not possible to translate a date from one calendar to the other. So therefore, the only way you can find parallels is by finding a global event that connects the two calendars. So that is called synchronism. And William Jones actually used Greek synchronism to map Alexander to Chandragupta Maurya, whereas Panditji actually uses Persian synchronism. And as an example, he also quotes Al-Barani and Al-Barani's texts that he wrote for the brief time that he was actually living in India. So that was his approach. So his work actually provided a complete framework for reconstruction of Indian chronology, because in his books, he identifies the problem to be solved, meaning the distortions and the distorters. So he identifies who, he identifies what they did. And then, of course, he constructs a complete chronology from primary sources from 3138 BC to 1193 AD. and he reconciles different sources of evidence. So this is the triangulation that took about 40 years, because he had to triangulate across all of these sources and make sure that the chronology is consistent and agrees with each of these sources. He identifies all the references required for his reconstruction. So if someone were to disagree, he has provided all the references, and it's very easy for anyone to use these references and reconstruct on their own and come up with their own chronology. Now, one of the things that a few people know is that he was one of the original people to refute the Aryan invasion theory. And his original finding is migrations out of India. And we will talk about that today. It is in one of his books. He actually shows that there were migrations out of India from very old times, from very ancient times. So the Puranas as a source of historical information. Now, Puranas there are two categories of Puranas. There are what are called the Mahapuranas. So for a text to be called a Mahapurana, it must meet 10 characteristics or attributes. And these are called Dasalakshana. Dasa for 10 and Lakshana for attribute. So then the second category of Puranas are called Upapuranas. These are minor, they're not as great as the Mahapuranas, but they have their own stature. But for a text to be called an Upapurana, it must meet 5 characteristics, which are called the Panchalakshana. So the Panchalakshana I've listed below, and those Panchalakshanas are Sarga, which describes Srishti. There is Pratisarga, which describes destruction at the end of Srishti. Then you have Manvantara, which deals with cosmic units of time. Then you have Vamsa and Vamsanacharita. So the genealogies of kings and gotras from the founding rishis, from the very beginning. And Vamsanacharita talks about significant historical personalities and some of their achievements and events in their lives. So chronologies can be reconstructed from Vamsa and Vamsanacharita. So Puranas are a tremendous source of historical information. So that was a biography of the author that I wanted to quickly recap. As far as the Purva Paksha is concerned, to define the problem to be solved, he wanted to understand the distortions, who made them, and what distortions they made, so that he could understand what corrections needed to be applied to correct the Indian chronology. So in that, primarily it was Max Muller, William Jones, Max Muller. So again, William Jones lived in the 18th century. Max Muller and the others were contemporaries, but lived about 80 years after William Jones. But the distortion was started by William Jones in the 18th century, and he was looking at Sanskrit texts through a Christian lens. And so he could not accept a date older than 4004 BC, which is when the world was created according to the Bible. And so William Jones arbitrarily decided that Indian history had to start in 2029 BC. So this is arbitrary. So he had to shrink the chronology to fit a biblical time frame. And so then, of course, I will not go through all these bullets, but the point is, these are all the distortions he had to introduce to corroborate the other distortions that he had put into place. So when he moves dates by 1200 years, there are many corroborating documents that also have to be distorted the same way so that they're consistent with one another. So this is what Pandit Kota Venkatachalam actually did in studying the problem. And my conclusion here is that philologists, William Jones was a philologist, Max Muller was a philologist. So philologists wrote Indian history based on very skimpy and questionable evidence. And finally, at the bottom of the slide, you can see on the left, the column on the left are from the Gupta dynasty, and then of course you have the Maurya dynasty also listed over here. So what William Jones did, see the first line, Sandrami, Sandracotus, and Sandrasiptus. These are the names found in Megasthenes' book called Indica, which was what William Jones was consulting. There he found 3 names, and that was Sandrami, Sandracotus, and Sandrasiptus. So, and he found in Indian history there were two Chandraguptas, and Chandragupta closely matches Sandrakotas. So in the two Chandraguptas, he had one Chandragupta in the Maurya dynasty around 1534 BC, which was about 1200 years before Alexander. Then he found Chandragupta in the Gupta dynasty, which was 327 BC, which is Alexander's time. So the Chandragupta of the Gupta dynasty was the actual contemporary of Alexander. Yet William Jones made Chandragupta Maurya the contemporary of Alexander, and that is how Indian history moved forward by 1200 years. So, and of course, here I have a list of dates that got distorted because of this. So, for example, Buddha, Patanjali, Adi Shankara all moved forward with 1200 years. Vikramaditya, Salivahana, and four complete dynasties that span 1300 years had to be removed. He actually removed them and said that Vikramaditya and Salivahana were fictitious characters. And then, of course, the date of the Mahabharata war that Panditji establishes as 3138 BC as a result of these distortions was moved to 1931 BC. So these are some of the examples that of the distortions he was able to uncover. So that is a brief recap of episodes 1 and 2, where we have a biography of the author and we have a definition of the problem to be solved. So today we will look at the Uttarapaksha, his response. What is the reconstructed chronology? So to understand that, I think it's important to point out that Panditji divides history into four parts. The first part is the very ancient, which is from the beginning of Srishti to the end of the sixth Manu. That is the very ancient portion. Then the modern, he divides into three parts again. So we will cover some of those today. So before we get started, what I wanted to first show are the primary sources that he consulted. And over here we have a small list. This is a very small list of the sources that Pandit Kota Venkatachalam actually consulted in his work on reconstruction of chronology. So, of course, the Vedas are obvious, the Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, the Shruti Siddhanta, Manusmriti, the Bhagavad Purana. So you can see the Puranas also that he has consulted over here. The Bhagavad Purana, Matsya, Vishnu, Bhavishya, Vayu Purana, Garga Samhita, this is for astronomy, and Brihat Samhita, Kalhanas Rajatarangini, this is for Kashmir's history, Nepal Rajavamsavali, Siddhanta Shiromani, and so on and so forth. So you can also see that he consults Buddhist texts for triangulation. He consults Jain texts for triangulation. He also consults Al-Barani's India for triangulation. And of course, here is another Purana called the Harivamsa Purana, and finally the Kali Yuga Rajavrittanta. Again, this is a small sample of the numerous texts that he had consulted in his reconstruction. So the four parts that I had alluded to are the very ancient, which is from the beginning of Srishti to the end of the sixth Manu. The ancient, he considered, was from the seventh Manu to the end of the 27th Mahayuga. And medieval history, he considers, is from the 28th Mahayuga to the end of the Mahabharata war. So from the beginning of the we are currently living in the 28th Mahayuga. So the medieval history is from the beginning of the Mahayuga to the end of the Mahabharata war, which Panditji establishes as 3138 BC. And finally, the modern history, he maps from the end of the Mahabharata war in 3138 BC to 1193 AD, which is about when Muslim invasions began in India, from which point Indian chronology is well documented. And so the date range that he covered was basically 3138 BC to 1193 AD, and he divided this into four parts. Now, having divided this into four parts, he spent all his time working on 1 and on 4. He did not spend too much time on 2 and 3, and that is why I've highlighted these two in yellow. And the reason he did not spend too much time on 2 and 3 is because he was satisfied that they're covered adequately in summary forms in our Puranas, in our Itihasas, and in many other texts. And so he did not find a need to work on 2 and 3, but he did work on 1 and on 4. And today I will try to cover the first one, which is the very ancient, from the beginning of Srishti to the end of the 6th Manu. So here is an artist's rendition of what our universe, our Brahmanda, looks like. And this is from his book. Let me hold up his book. This is from the book called Brahmanda Srishti Vijnanam. So, although the title is in Telugu or Sanskrit, the book itself is actually in English. So, Brahmanda Srishti Vijnanam is his first book, published in 1949. We have a second reprint that was published in 2011. And in that, he describes the process of Srishti. He describes the structure of the Brahmanda. He talks about units of time. And so you see in this diagram, you see you see Vishnu here lying in the Garbhodaka ocean. And on top of this is one Brahmanda, which is our Brahmanda. And in that Brahmanda, you will find that there are 14 different lokas. So you've got the 7 Urdhva lokas, and you have the 7 Patala lokas. And the structure of the Brahmanda is described extremely well in our Mahasankalpam. The Mahasankalpam is something that is usually recited at special events and special occasions. And in the Mahasankalpam covers the structure of the Brahmanda and describes the structure of the Brahmanda. And there are oblique references in the Nitya Sankalpam as well. A Nitya Sankalpa, which people do during pujas, at the beginning of the pujas, in their Nitya Sankalpa, there are oblique references to this. For instance, the easiest way to remember the 7 Urdhva lokas are from your Nitya Sankalpa. Om Bhuhu, Om Bhuvaha, Om Swaha, Om Mahaha, Om Janaha, Om Tapaha, Om Satyam. So those are the 7 names of the 7 Urdhva lokas. Bhuloka, Bhuvarloka, and so on to the Satyaloka. So those are the 7 Urdhva lokas. And then, of course, you have the 7 Patala lokas, which is Atala, Vitala, Sutala, all the way to Patala. So these are the 7 Patala lokas. And right in the middle of that, you find our Bhuloka. So this is the Bhuloka, and these are the 14 lokas, 7 Urdhva lokas and 7 Patala lokas, and right in the center is our Bhuloka. So this is the structure of the universe. So now the Jyotish Chakra. What is the Jyotish Chakra? Our time is kept by the planetary and stellar systems. And the planetary and stellar systems are actually in the Bhuvarloka, in the plane of the Bhuvarloka, which is above the Bhuloka. So that if you can look at my cursor, I'm pointing to the Bhuloka here at the center. And above the Bhuloka is the Bhuvarloka, and the planetary and stellar systems are in that plane. And over here on the bottom right, I'm actually showing the Jyotish Chakra. So what this is given 360 degrees, we have divided that 360 degrees firstly into 12 rasis, meaning zodiac signs. So we have 12 zodiac signs fit into 360 degrees, so that each zodiac sign, assuming that they're all equal in duration, is about 30 degrees. So 30 times 12 is 360. And superimposed upon that are the 27 nakshatras. So 360 degrees divided by 27 nakshatras is about 13 degrees and 30 minutes per nakshatra. So one rasi has slightly more than 2 nakshatras, and that is the basis of our calendar. And so the Jyotish Chakra is the timekeeper in the Brahmanda. It exists in the Bhuvarloka on the z-axis, z-axis. All the stellar and planetary systems, at the beginning, they start in the Mesha Rasi or the Ashwini Nakshatra on Sunday, Chaitra Sukla Pajyami. So that is the origin. And then when Srishti begins, then each of these bodies start their orbits, each in their own orbit, each at their own speed. And so over time, of course, they do not travel together. And but that is how we use their movement and their known movements as our timekeeper. And these, of course, get reset after every pralaya. I mean, there are three pralayas. There is a Yuga Pralaya, there is a Jala Pralaya, and there is a Mahapralaya. So we'll get to that in a second. So, and after each Pralaya, all of these stellar and planetary systems again converge and start at the Mesha Rasi in the next cycle. So this is our timekeeper in the Brahmanda. So this is a summary of what the structure of the Brahmanda actually is. And I'd like to draw your attention again to the book that he covers all of this detail in. That is the Brahmanda Srishti Vijnana. So having covered the structure, I think we should look at the duration. So what is the duration of the Brahmanda? So here, the duration of the Brahmanda coincides with the lifespan of Brahma. So the lifespan of Brahma is 100 years on his time scale, not in our human time scale. So over here in this diagram at the very top, the horizontal line at the very top represents the duration of the Brahmanda, which is the lifespan of Brahma. And Brahma's lifespan is divided into two halves. So each half is called each half is called a parardha. So two parardhas. There's one first parardha covers Brahma from year 1 to 50, and the second parardha is from 51 to 100. So in that, if you look at one day in the life of Brahma, then that one day is actually called a kalpa. So a kalpa is not a complete 24 hours as we know it. There are two kalpas required for that 24 hours. So you have the daytime, which is called the Udaya kalpa, and you have the nighttime, which is called the Kshaya kalpa. So an Udaya kalpa plus the Kshaya kalpa is one ahoratri, which is one day, a full day in the life of Brahma. So now, and then if you look at a kalpa, the kalpa is one day in the life of Brahma, and the kalpa you can see is about what are called 14 manvantras. So a kalpa can be subdivided into 14 equal parts, and each part is called a manvantara. So, and then if you look at a single manvantara, that manvantara, each manvantara is presided over by a manu. And you look at a manvantara, it actually has 71 Mahayugas, or what are called Divya Yugas. So a manvantara has 71 Divya Yugas. And then if you look at a Mahayuga, you find that it has the 4 yugas that we are all familiar with. The Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, and the Kali Yuga comprise one Mahayuga. And 71 such Mahayugas is one Manvantara, and 14 such Manvantaras is one day in the life of Brahma. And Brahma on that time scale lives to be 100 years. And we have a reference to this in our Nitya Sankalpa. It says, Sri Mahavishnoragnaya Pravartamanasya Adyu Brahmanaha Dvitiya Parardhe. So it says second Parardha, Dvitiya Parardhe. We're in the second Parardha of Brahma's lifespan. Dvitiya Parardhe Svetavaraha Kalpe. So we are saying we're in the Kalpa of Svetavaraha. Vaivasvata Manvantare. So we are in the Manvantara presided by Vaivasvata. Ashtavimsati Tame Kali Yuge. So we are in a Manvantara has 71 Divya Yugas, so we are in the Manvantara presided over by Vaivasvata, and in that Mahayuga, we are in the Manvantara, we are in the 28th Mahayuga, and specifically we are in the Kali Yuga of that 28th Mahayuga. So that is in our Nitya Sankalpa. So anyone familiar with the Nitya Sankalpa will recognize this immediately, and this way, we actually maintain the age of the universe, because we are reciting it every day, incrementing it each day with reference to the beginning of Srishti. So based on that, the age of our Brahmanda in 1944, Pandit Kota Venkatachalam actually calculated this in 1944, and he felt it was 194 crore years, meaning about 2 billion years. So now, going beyond that, this is to understand our Brahmanda, but if you go beyond our Brahmanda, you will find that Brahma's entire lifespan is one kalpa of Vishnu, meaning 1 day or half a day of Vishnu. And Vishnu's lifespan is 100 crore years on Vishnu's timescale, not Brahma's timescale. So this is all summarized in this book. It has a lot more detail, and I have tried to summarize all of this into these two slides over here. Now, here, Panditji has identified all the kalpas. We talk about kalpas. So, kalpa being 1 day, and if a month is 30 days, then of course you would have 30 kalpas in a month. So, you have the Sukla Paksha, and then you have the Krishna Paksha kalpas. So, these are, and each one has its own name. So, Sweta Varaha kalpa is the very first kalpa during Sukla Paksha of Brahma. So that's why I've highlighted this in red. And this is the kalpa that we are living in right now in the 51st year of Brahma. Dvitiya Pararde, Sweta Varaha Kalpe. And then if you look at the Manus, see, here are the 14 Manus listed. And again, highlighted in red is the Manu that presides over this Manvantara that we are living in. And it is the Vaivas of the Manvantara. So again, triangulation. Bhaskaracharya has a text on astronomy and called Siddhanta Siromani, and in that he quotes, and Panditji references this quotation. He says, from the creation of the universe, 6 Manus, 27 Mahayugas, and in the 28th Mahayuga, the Krita, Treta, Dwapara have passed, and in this Kali Yuga, 3,179 years have elapsed to the end of Vikramaseka. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Vikramaseka is the end of Vikramaditya's lifespan and the beginning of Salivahana's, the Salivahana calendar. And so for triangulation, of course, you have to reconcile this with other findings. And then, of course, he also observes that the Bharatiya number system from ancient texts. So there are named numbers, and the largest number that he was able to find is called a Maha-Ogha. A Maha-Ogha is 1 followed by 62 zeros. 1 followed by 62 zeros is the largest named number that Panditji was able to find. I thought this was very interesting, so I actually created a table from his book just to let people know what existed in ancient times. And what we can conclude from this is that there was a decimal number system already in vogue from Vedic times. They used positional notation, and this way large numbers are easily represented. For instance, if you had to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, you're talking about very large distances. And to represent very large distances, imagine how difficult it would be to use Roman numbers to represent the distance between the Earth and the Sun. But it was not so in our Vedic times, because we had large numbers. They were well known and they were easily represented, and they were used for time as well as for distance. And they, particularly in astronomy, were used for distances. So I thought this was very interesting, and I wanted to actually highlight this from Panditji's book. Now, changing topics. Now we're going to his second book, which is Manavascript Vijnanam. And this book also published in 1949, Manavascript Vijnanam. In that, he talks about Jambudvipa. So in Nitya Sankalpa, there are two aspects to the Nitya Sankalpa. One is, as we have looked earlier, it is time. It is the concept of time from the beginning of Srishti. So in the Sankalpa covers time and then it covers place. So we have covered the time part, and now let's look at the place. He says, where are we? Jambudvipe Bharatavarshe Bharatakhande Meroho Dakshina Digbhage Srisailasya Vayabhya Pradeshe Krishna Godavariyoho Madhyadeshe. So that is what Nitya Sankalpa, well, that was for somebody who lives in Andhra Pradesh between Krishna and Godavari rivers. So it is in Jambudvipa. So the question is, what is Jambudvipa? And Panditji covers that in his second book, Manavascript Vijnanam. And this is a picture I have reproduced from that book. And in that book, he shows where Jambudvipa is located. Now, this picture is an image of the Earth from the top, from the North Pole. If you're looking at the Earth from the top, then the Earth as actually was divided in ancient times into the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And Panditji says that all the landmass was in the Northern Hemisphere. There was no land in the South. It was all submerged. So the Northern Hemisphere is Jambudvipa, the Surabhaga, which is where the great people and devout people live. The southern landmass was the Asura Bhaga, which is all ocean. That's where all the Asuras live, where the land is submerged. So, as Adiji was saying earlier on about one landmass, Panditji in this book states that there was a single landmass in the northern hemisphere, which we call Jambudvipa. Sorry about that. There's light shining on my face. So the northern hemisphere, he says, covered Asia, Europe, Africa, North America, and two pieces of land here. If you look at my cursor at the bottom, you'll see they're in green. There is Gondwana and there is Lemuria. Gondwana was a landmass stretching from Africa to India, and Lemuria is a landmass connecting India to the Asia Pacific. So this was a single landmass, and in ancient times, you could actually walk from India to Africa. You could walk from India to Borneo, Sumatra, almost all the way to Australia. And so this was a landmass. So let me describe highlights from this picture. So what you see is, again, he's divided this circumference into 360 degrees, and he's showing the origin is over here at the bottom. And he says at the origin, at the equator, meaning zero meridian, is Lanka. The Lanka from the Ramayana is at the origin, which is 0 degrees longitude and 0 degrees latitude, which means at the intersection of the prime meridian and the equator. Now, the prime meridian in those days passed through India until the Britishers changed it and moved it to Greenwich. So the prime meridian is the longitude that passes through Hastinapur, Ujjain, Kanyakumari, and Lankapuri. So Lankapuri actually is at 1 degree north, but close enough that we can assume that it is on the equator. So Lankapuri is here at the equator, and if you traverse 90 degrees clockwise, you find there was a town called Romaka. And then another 90 degrees clockwise is a town called Siddhapuri on the other side of the world from Lankapuri. And then another 90 degrees clockwise is Yavakoti. So he identifies these as highlights on the circumference of the Earth. And now, the interesting thing about Lanka, and we've talked about this, I think, in our first episode, when Adiji asked me what Panditji said about Lanka and its location. So even the Ramayana, if you look at the Kishkindakanda, and you look at 41st Sarga, slokas 8 to 25, tell you that Hanuman flew south from Mahendragiri, south, not east. So Rameshwaram versus Kanyakumari has always been a big debate. So, but the Ramayana clearly states that Hanuman flew south from Mahendragiri, not east. and it's probably useful to point out that there are no mountains near Rameshwaram. There is no Mahendragiri near Rameshwaram. Mahendragiri is at Kanyakumari. So this is the structure of Jambudvipa, because we hear it often. It's in our Nitya Sankalpa, but few people have actually been able to visualize it. And I think Panditji provides a wonderful description in this book called Manavascript Vijnanam. I apologize for the glare. Continuing on, in Manavascript Vijnanam, again, the book was published in 1949. He talks about Srishti in Bharatavarsha. So we have covered the geography, and now he's describing details of that geography. And he's saying that Swayambhuva manifests himself in Bharatavarsha. That happens at the beginning of Srishti. And Bharatavarsha is divided into several parts. You have what is called Brahmavarta, and then you have other parts. So the Brahmavarta is located between two rivers, and that is Saraswati and Drishadvati. So I've highlighted Drishadvati in blue over here. So this is the Drishadvati river, and here is the Saraswati river in brown. And you'll see that in ancient times, the Saraswati river starts in the Himalayan mountain range, goes through the western part of India, to Africa and through Africa. So in this diagram, what he's trying to, Panditji is showing, is in the ancient Bharatavarsha, here is Bharatavarsha at the center. Gondwana, Lemuria are shown over here, which are now submerged, but used to be one single landmass in those days. And he shows that the Saraswati river goes to and through Africa and dumps its water near the southern and the western ocean. So his point was that at the equator, below the equator was the southern ocean, because it was all submerged. But then also in the north, he says, in the northern hemisphere, on the west is the Western Ocean, and on the east is the Eastern Ocean. So he's now showing the contours of Bharatavarsha. Then, of course, and this is a summary of a lot of detail in the book, but he names certain tirthas that were on the Saraswati, and I have a list of names over here. So then he talks about migration. So Srishti began in Bharatavarsha, and as the population increased, there were migrations out of Brahmavarta, and they moved to other places like the Brahmarshi Desa, Aryavarta, Madhya Desa, Yagneya Desa. So, and then he starts describing other countries and tribes outside of Bharatavarsha. And so the Kiratas, he said, were to the east of Brahmavarta, and the Yavanas were to the west. And then, of course, he touches upon the migrations out of India. So, Dasyus. The term Dasyu first appears in the Rig Veda, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the point is that Dasyus and knowledge. So, Dasyus were the people who migrated out of India, and they took their knowledge with them. And that is how knowledge traveled from India to the rest of the world. So he identifies three major migrations out of Bharat from ancient times. There was one that went to the east, which is through China, Japan, through the Bering Strait, like Adiji had described. And because all that was a single landmass, so it was easy to cross. So the eastern migration went through China, through the Bering Strait, and populated North and South America. And then there was a second migration to the northwest. And that migration, or those migrations, populated Greece, Rome, Etruria, Germany, Britain, Scandinavia. And then there was a third set of migrations directly due west, which are Persia, Egypt, Africa, and Assyria. So this is the out of India theory that Panditji had proposed in 1949, and it completely rebuts the Aryan invasion theory and says there is absolutely no proof, but there is a tremendous amount of evidence to support the fact that there were migrations actually out of India. And then, of course, he says that there were massive migrations after the Mahabharata war, and he says that this cycle repeats after every pralaya. So coming to the migrations out of India, what I have tried to do here, this is a map of the northern portion of Bharatavarsha. So for reference, for easy identification, I have circled Kashmir in brown. This is roughly where Kashmir is. So with respect to Kashmir, you can see the Yavana kingdoms in yellow. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in yellow. And then you see the Sakastanas in green. And I will explain all this in a second. So out of India, migrations which were Dasyus, Anaryas, Mlechas, these are synonyms. So Dasyu or Anarya or a Mlecha mean the same thing. So where do they appear? The Rig Veda first mentions the term Dasyu, which is explained in the Manusmriti and the Harivamsa Purana. And so there are several texts that actually corroborate this evidence. And the Manusmriti actually identifies the tribes that are referred to as Dasyus. So Dasyus were actually Kshatriya kings that had stopped observing Vedic rituals. So the rest of Bharatavarsha excommunicated these Dasyus, and over time they were forced to the northwest of the country from where the migrations began. So some of the tribes that he mentioned are Yavanas, Kiratas, Dorvas, Daradas, the Sakas, Chinas, and so on. Now, why this is important is because as these migrations occurred out of India and they started colonizing different parts of the world, then the areas where they lived began to be known by the name of their tribe. The only difference is that they were anglicized names. So here I try to show Panditji actually provides a mapping. So the Yavanas became also known as Yona. Yona colonized southern and eastern Greece, and that region is now called Ionia. We know it as Ionia, but I suppose Ionia could be pronounced as Iona. And the origin of that term is actually the Yavanas from Bharatavarsha. The Kiratas settled in a place which is now called Crete, and so on. So the Sakas, and this is highlighted in green, these are Sakas are the people that actually settled in Persia, which we know today as Iran, and they are called Sakas. And when we get into the second part of the Uttarapaksha, we'll see why this is important and why this is highlighted here in green. The Yavana kingdoms that we see in the edicts of Ashoka, when constructing chronology, the term Yavana appears a lot. And there is one school of thought that maintains that they're Greeks who came to India, which is not true, because Panditji says the migrations are out of India, and the Yavanas migrated out of India and settled in Iona. But the Yavanas had 5 kingdoms, and they're listed here. They're called Abhisara, Uraga, Simhapura, Divyakataka, Uttara Jyotisha. So these 5 are in yellow, and I've tried to highlight them in yellow on the map so you can see where they are. So with respect to Kashmir, they are to the west of Kashmir, and you can see that Persia or Sakastana in green is to the west of the Yavana kingdoms. It's also important to point out that the common everyday language spoken in Brahmavata was Prakrit and not Sanskrit, and that Prakrit missed some alphabets. For example, there was no La in Prakrit, and they could not pronounce Sa in Sanskrit, so they replaced it with Ha. And so, for example, the word Sindhu became Hindu in Prakrit, and that is what became prevalent in Saka, meaning Iran or Persia. And in Persia, India was referred to as Hindu Desa. And then Panditji also points out, and this is part of the rebuttal to the Aryan invasion theory and the claim that knowledge traveled from west to east, meaning from Greece to India. So Panditji refutes that. And he says, in Homer's Iliad, Homer's Iliad is celebrated as a magnum opus by the West. Now, if you look at the Greek civilization, there was no country called Greece before 500 BC. Because before 500 BC, there were feudal lords, and there were small city states. There were small city states like Athens, Crete, Sparta, and so you had these, and they had these regional identities. So an Athenian was proud of being an Athenian, and he felt he was very different from a Cretan, or for example, for that matter, from a Spartan. So they had these loyalties to their regional identities, and it was not until 500 BC that all these were united under one umbrella and called Greece. So Greece did not exist, and that becomes important when you have to when you have to correlate and understand the references that you're looking at in the reconstruction of chronology. So now, coming back to Homer's Iliad, in Iliad, there are many references to topics that originated in India. So, for the cremation is basically a Hindu tradition, but there are references to cremation in Greece. There are references to seamless fabrics. So, if you look at our saris or dhotis, you find that they're a single seamless fabric. There are no stitches. Indians in ancient times did not wear tailored clothes. They wore single seamless fabrics, and you see things like saris and dhotis in Greece. And Homer actually makes a mention of them. Now, why is Homer important? The point is that the Greek city-states started around 1000 BC. Homer lived around 800 BC, and that's about when the city-states were about 200 years old. Yet, in the Iliad, Homer is describing a civilization that is far more advanced than the city-states of that time. And this is, Panditji claims that this is civilizational memory that the Yavanas took from India, and the Iliad was actually talking about events from the Mahabharata and Ramayana. So that's another data point that I found extremely interesting. And then finally, the legislative decree in the 5th century BC, because they wanted to create a nation called Greece, they even banned the term Yona and replaced it with Greek. So there was no Yona after the 15th century BC. So if there is an epigraph, if there is an inscription, if you find a text with the term Yona or Iona or Ionia in it, it is certain that that is older than 500 BC. It cannot be after 500 BC because by government decree, that term was banned. By legislative decree, that term was banned and replaced with the term Greece. So this is a summary of these two books, which covers very ancient history, the Brahmanda Srishti Vijnanam and the Manava Srishti Vijnanam. And I think this is probably a good place to stop today. So Adiji, if you have any questions, sir.
It was very amazing. And also one of the things which can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
It was very amazing. And one of the things which you said about the prime meridian, also, which is brings to the point that from Meru Parvat, if you draw a line, Meru Parvat, Rohtak, Ujjain, and dial down to Lanka, which is, see, the India's map is slightly this way, like it's going this way from the prime meridian. So, but if you draw that line, then you'll see the exact Lanka, and then there is not much degree variance over there. But yes, Lanka is slightly on the western side from that line. You're right over there. So thank you so much, and it was wonderful to see the Uttar Paksh of Pandit Kota Venkatchalam's book, and the video link, people can see that. and see all the other videos of Shastri Ji, which he has done based on the books of Pandit Kota Venkachalam. And how many books have you published so far now?
We've published 6. I've shown
Six.
2 here.
Yeah.
Here is a third one. It's called The Plot in Indian Chronology. There is one book here called Indian Eras. There is a book here called The Historicity of Vikramaditya and Salivahana. If you remember, in this presentation, I'd shown how William Jones had removed them from history, and Panditji is showing evidence that they actually existed. They were real people. And then finally, The Age of the Mahabharata War. So
Yeah,
these are
William Jones creates a lot of mythology based on, it looks like he's the classical character of Pirates of the Caribbean. Instead of that, we can say the pirates of the actual history.
uh,
But people like him. People like him. There are many things people appreciate his work. And many Indologists also appreciate his work. But, my point is very simple. If he has said one thing wrong, then what is the guarantee that the other things are wrong? Like sometimes you have to admit also, yes, you don't know. Number one is if you don't know Sanskrit, yes, you don't know. And it is impossible for many, I mean, not all, but many Western theologians or so-called historians to actually go wrong because they start at the wrong premise. Like if you start from 1, you will never reach 0. You will reach number 9 because you don't believe in 0. So there is no you cannot complete your mathematical studies without the number 0. So if you start somewhere wrong, then you'll reach a wrong conclusion in the first place. So I believe that nowadays everyone has to be humble, including us, but at the same time, we cannot just blindly refute the authority of Vyasadeva we cannot because that person is a Parusha, is not a human generally because it is an avatar. It is considered very special circumstances are there mentioned in Mahabharata itself, the birth of Vyasadeva. But people openly and willingly they start commenting on Vyasadeva, and people like William Jones who have no connection with any history whatsoever, they became historian by chance.
they were
And Vyas,
linguists.
huh?
They were linguists, not historians.
Linguists, not historians. And some people they question you and our acharyas. Every single dharmic acharya has a strong connection to history. Every single, because without history they cannot become acharya. They have to understand which the previous acharyas did, what philosophical points they brought in, and which era they brought in. And generally people separate that out. And most of the historical societies in the West were created by the governments to further their colonial agendas. So colonialism has ended, but coloniality has not ended.
No, that's true.
So
in fact, I'd like to make a couple of points here.
yes, go ahead.
That William Jones initially actually fell in love with the kavyas that he was reading, like Shakuntalam. He actually fell in love with the kavyas. And when he discovered the chronology, he was excited. And he actually proposed this and took this back to England. And apparently, the church was upset at William Jones. And so at that point, because if you show the Indian civilization was older and more intellectually evolved, it would follow that the West got its knowledge from India. And that is something that was not to be encouraged. And so at that point, the distortion was deliberate and it was methodical and structured. So William Jones created this theory of the Proto-Indo-European languages, and that there was a language older than Sanskrit that Sanskrit was derived from. All this was to basically to disprove that knowledge traveled from the east to the west, and so no, this was a concerted effort done deliberately. It was not an honest mistake. Kadiji?
Thank you so much, Shastri ji, and very grateful to Pandit Kota Venkachalam for coming out with such deep writings. And people should read his work. And also, I always say, make your own conclusions. Don't depend on others to make conclusions for you. Gone are the days where others should make conclusions for you. All the Mahabharata Ramayana history is meant for you to start thinking. And Bhagavad Gita advises you to think, use your own intellect which you have received, and take guidance, because important, without guidance you cannot complete any research work. So start somewhere and reach your own conclusions, and be humble that you can be wrong, and then again you need to seek out the answers. So and people, it's all, we are in human life, we all make mistakes, we have four faults, and one of them is tendency to commit mistakes. So, and accept that folly, and then move on. That will be a very happy journey, believe me, trust me. And thank you so much, Shastri ji, and thank you all the viewers for watching. Do like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your feedback. Namaste.
Namaste.